Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Armajani, and I'm professor in the Department of Peace Studies at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. I remind all of us that both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relations with our Native Nation neighbors. I welcome all of you to the 2023 Peace Studies Conference, which is entitled The Environment: Issues in Justice, Conflict, and Peacebuilding, a conference in honor of the late Father Rene McGraw. This conference is one of several events that are part of the Presidential Inauguration Week for Dr. Brian Brees, who is the president of the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Brees, who will offer the opening words of this conference. Brian J. Brees, PhD, became the first person to serve as president of both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. He began his presidency of these institutions on July 1st, 2022. During his first year, among many other accomplishments, Dr. Brees implemented strong integration, launched a strategic planning process, and rebuilt admission and enrollment. Before coming to St. Ben's and St. John's, Dr. Brees was the president of St. Norbert College in De Pere, Wisconsin. Dr. Brees spent the 22 years prior to that at St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brees.
Thank you, John. It is a privilege to be here and to welcome you. And it's an exciting week, an inauguration week. But good afternoon, and welcome to the 34th Annual College of St. Benedict and St. John's University Peace Studies Conference. This is one of our longest held and proudest academic traditions. And I'd like to add a word of gratitude to Jeff Anderson and the Peace Studies, Environmental Studies departments for co-sponsoring this wonderful event. This gathering, being together here today, continues to demonstrate this community's true dedication and commitment to the exploration of and the devotion to peace. We hold a commitment to peace not as a hypothetical or an ideal, but as a tangible, as an attainable, as a mandatory objective for us collectively to pursue what it means, peace. We are a driving force in this effort. In the last 33 years, a remarkable cadre of students, alums, and respected thought leaders in the field have raised their voices in this space. And I cannot think of a better, more exceptional way to begin Inauguration Week, which is a celebration of a great traditions of both St. Ben's and St. John's, and an imagination and thinking about our future. What a great way to start this week. Through the years, this conference has explored all aspects and avenues of peace. It has lit the fire of action and change in generations of students, this, no doubt, another generation, who have gone on into the world to pursue peace. I thank you for being here and for continuing this legacy of pursuing peace. And I look forward to what we learned together today, and I look forward to our continued and collective commitment to the pursuit of peace. Thank you for being here, and have a great conference.
Dr. Brees, thank you for your opening words in support of this conference. I also thank several other persons for their support of the conference, including Jeff Anderson, Kelly Kramer, Derek Larson, John Merkel, Ron Pignucco, Brandy White, Adrian Zeller, and all of the speakers, presenters, and moderators at today's conference. In addition, I thank the co-sponsors of this conference, who are the St. Ben's St. John's Department of Peace Studies, the St. Ben's St. John's Department of Environmental Studies, and the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning at St. Ben's and St. John's. This conference is dedicated to the memory of Father Rene McGraw, who was instrumental in the founding of the Peace Studies Department at St. Ben's and St. John's. He passed away at age 87 on November 20th, 2021. He was a professor in CSB-SJU's Peace Studies and Philosophy departments. He was an inspiration and mentor whose dedication to social justice was evident in his work and his service to countless students. I am delighted that this conference is a tribute to him. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce the opening keynote speaker for today's conference, Dr. Ken Conca. Ken Conca, PhD, is Professor of International Relations in the School of International Service at American University. His research focuses on environment, conflict, and peace building, water politics and governance, and the role of the United Nations in environmental governance. His recent books include An Unfinished Foundation, The United Nations and Global Environmental Governance, and the Oxford Handbook of Water Politics and Policy, both of which were published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Conca is an award-winning pioneer in the field of environmental peace building. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Conca.
Thank you, John. It's a real pleasure to be here. I have to say, I told some friends of mine that I was coming, and it turned out that one of them was an alum of St. John's, and he immediately launched into a conversation about what a great experience it had been, how life-changing it had been for him to be here. And this character named McGraw kept turning up in the conversation as he was telling me this. And so I was absolutely delighted to learn that part of what we're doing here is memorializing his life and his work. I also have to say it's a pleasure to be speaking at a women's college. I started teaching at Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts, which is another outstanding women's college in the United States. And I learned a lot about teaching, about students, about the dynamics of gender in the classroom, and a range of other things that have really served me well over my 30-plus years as a college instructor. So it's fantastic to be here, and I thank you very much for the invitation. Let me just get this started, and we're off. I also have to warn you, as I was telling John, one of the first courses I took, I got the teaching evaluations at the end of the semester, and I eagerly tore the envelope open because this is in the pre-digital days. I've been teaching for a long time. And one of the students had written, if I had 20 minutes to live, I would want to spend them with Dr. Conca, because Dr. Conca can make 20 minutes feel like 2 hours. So I'll try not to do, let's see if I've learned anything in the 30 years since. So this is a heavy topic. We know that the health of the planet, the health of its ecosystems, the health of its communities is in peril. The problems are big, many of them are getting larger, and our responses to date have almost always been inadequate. Whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about water scarcity, the health of the Earth's forests, problems of land degradation and soil erosion. We know that these are public health problems. We know that these are ecological problems. We know that they are justice problems, as we'll talk quite a bit today about, because the effects are distributed very unevenly, and the aid and responses are also distributed very unevenly. But the point I want to leave you with is that they're also violence problems. And I picked a couple of examples ripped from the headlines. If you've been following the news of the world at all, you know that just last week there was some horrific flooding in Libya, with casualties estimated to be in the tens of thousands of people. Some of that was because of unusually intense rains, possibly a signature of climate change, but much of the problem was exacerbated because there were two dams on a river just upstream from the town of Derna in eastern Libya where this happened that failed. And the reason that they failed was because they've been poorly maintained and poorly managed. And the reason they had been poorly maintained and poorly managed is that they were a casualty of the Civil War and the fragmented governance and ineffective governance that Libya has been left with today in the wake of that conflict. Earlier this year, we had another episode where a dam failed, causing human disaster and ecological disaster, but with a somewhat different spin. This was the Nova Kakhovka Dam in eastern Ukraine, one of the most heavily industrialized regions on the planet, one of the most polluted regions on the planet. In this case, in the Libyan case, the dam was a casualty of the war. In this case, the dam was weaponized and became a tool of the war because it was deliberately destroyed, apparently, by Russian forces. Much attention has been given to how this has disrupted agricultural productivity and impacted world food markets. But as the figure in the bottom here shows, each of these diamonds is an industrial facility, many of them working with large volumes of chemicals and highly toxic substances that are directly in the downstream path of the flooding. And in the coming months and years, we're going to learn a lot about the toxification of this space as a result of the destruction of the dam. Sadly, there are many such examples. And as John mentioned in the introduction, I've done a lot of work over the years with the UN Environment Program and its conflict and disaster management activities. And this diagram is something that our group came up with to try to conceptualize some of the problems of violence that surround the environment and natural resources. It's not a perfect diagram, and I actually have a lot of problems with it. We won't bother with that. There's an old joke that says a camel is a horse that was designed by a committee. And this has even got the hump right there in the middle. But what it's trying to show is over the arc of conflict, over the cycle of conflict, in the pre-conflict period when conflict and tensions are rising, in periods of conflict itself, let's say civil war, or what we're seeing in Ukraine, or many other kinds of examples. And then one hopes in the period when tensions are abating, what we might call a post-conflict period, often very messy period. There are many different ways that the environment and natural resources can be linked to violence, linked to conflict. They may be the source of the tensions themselves. Forests are being destroyed, people depend on those forests for their livelihood and their culture, tensions ensue. Even when the environment is not at the epicenter of the conflict, although often it will be, but even when it's not, often the plundering of natural resources can be used to finance conflict, to purchase armaments, to purchase soldiers, and to keep civil wars going. In fact, civil wars that have a strong natural resource signature are known to be much more intractable, to last longer, and to be harder to resolve. And one of the reasons for that is because of the exploitation of natural resources to finance the conflict. And of course, as we saw in the Russian case, it can become a weapon of war. As we saw in the Libyan case, it can be damaged by the conflict. And even in the post-conflict period, if people's livelihoods and cultures depend on how they relate to nature and natural resources, then there's likely to be tensions around that. And you might find yourself right back where you were initially, or you might find yourself with a whole set of tensions in the peace-building period. For example, if the new government wants to accelerate the exploitation of natural resources to finance recovery and peace, and financing recovery and peace is a good thing, but that exploitation might lead to a whole new set of tensions among local communities or different identity groups and so on. So one of the tasks of this emergent field of environmental peace building is to recognize those linkages, try to manage them, try to minimize them, try to address them. But the message I want to leave with you today is more about the bottom of this figure. The blue, it's not Republican and Democrat, red and blue, it just happened to be blue, about the arc of opportunities for peace building that are also present in these circumstances. And so building trust, facilitating dialogue, finding joint cooperative opportunities, softening people's hardened conflict identities of self and other, and maybe trying to encourage the nurturing of more of a place-based identity. You know, we don't have to think simply as Israelis and Palestinians. We're also all residents of the Jordan Valley, and it's getting smacked by climate change, and maybe we have a shared interest in that. That is not to say that people will cease to think of themselves as Israelis and Palestinians, but maybe there's a way that that doesn't have to be the only way that they think of themselves and the only way that they think about engaging with others. So that's environmental peace building, managing the red, but also being opportunistic about the blue in the service of peace. So over 20 years ago, I and one of my doctoral students and some colleagues put out what was really the first book in this space. It was called Environmental Peacemaking, basically making the arguments that I just suggested, basically talking about that figure and so on. And the reason that we did that was we were concerned that at the time we were seeing an increasingly militarized discourse around our environmental problems. The environment as a threat, the environment as a trigger for violent conflict. And we recognized the reality of that, but we were very concerned that was not going to be the way to frame the problem such that we could tap into the cooperative opportunities, the peace-building opportunities that were essential. One example, the UN Secretary General was very much criticized, and with reason, for calling the civil war in Sudan, and in particular the Darfur conflict, essentially an episode of genocide in Sudan, calling it the first climate change war, to call attention to the UN's climate change agenda and so on. Well, there's a climate signature to what happened in that conflict. But the problem is calling it a climate change war absolves the political and economic actors who are actually responsible for the acts of genocide. And this kind of discourse matters. There is actually now a Guinness Book of World Records entry for the first climate change war. And the winner of that Guinness record is Darfur. Now, fortunately, as it says over here, this record is currently inactive and no applications are being accepted for it. And that's a good thing because we don't want any more climate change wars trying to claim to be the first. But how we talk about and frame these issues is absolutely critical for the possibilities that we can envision. So for that reason, we put this book together and tried to sort of stand the script on its head and argue for the peacemaking opportunities around the environment. Couple of premises here. First, that environmental issues have certain properties that are very helpful to bring people who may be in tension and in conflict together. They're very difficult to solve unilaterally. It requires cooperative engagements. It requires sustained cooperative engagements. And I want to call attention in particular to the last point, that it does not simply engage people's interests, although it does do that. It also engages their identities, their sense of place, their sense of community, their vision of what the future may look like. And it's that combination of interest and identity that we were arguing was particularly powerful. And the second piece of the argument was that those properties could be used to try to transform the very challenging conditions that we face in settings of conflict. Mistrust is obviously quite high. Uncertainty is also quite high. As a result of that high uncertainty and mistrust, actors in a conflict often retreat into very, very short time horizons for making decisions. Doing the work with the UN Environment Program, there were some tragic examples in Afghanistan of people cutting down orchards that were providing sustainable livelihoods through fruit harvesting and nut harvesting because they didn't know if they were going to be able to stay in that place or would they be driven out of that place by the conflict. So they made what was probably a short-term rational decision to cut the trees and sell the wood and cash out what could have been a long-standing. So this problem of the short, narrow time horizons and the situations that people find themselves in and the kind of decision-making they have to retreat into is a big problem. And of course, the exclusionary identities and the borders that conflicts erect, whether it's the border of a country or the border between identity groups or the borders of race, class, and gender, these are the challenges that we have to try to transform in situations of conflict. And our argument was that the environment can be a useful tool in trying to do that under the right circumstances and managed in the right way. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is an idea or a set of practices that was born in the academic laboratory or born in our book or anything like that, because there's always been a pretty rich community of practice. These are some of the more internationally prominent organizations that have engaged in this work, most of them for quite a long time. And of course, there are thousands of grassroots groups around the planet that do this sort of work, whether or not they brand it as environmental peace building. When we look at the activities of groups like this and ask what do they do, we find that there are some common strategies at work. The idea, first of all, the red in that figure, right? Managing the environmental tensions, trying to promote stakeholder dialogue, trying to promote cooperation, compromise, et cetera. But also the blue, right? Trying to identify places where, I'll give you a few examples in a moment, where actors can gain mutually from coordinated environmental action. Trying to use that cooperation to build trust, which is a very challenging thing to do in conflict settings. Hopefully in the process, softening at least to some extent the exclusionary identities that have brought us into tension and build and sustain the kind of social networks that are so hard to sustain across divides of conflict. So a couple of examples. Search for Common Ground is a grassroots conflict resolution organization, has local community chapters in several countries around the world. that are faced with divided societies and various forms of conflict. They have started to engage in the practice of doing community-based environmental cleanups. They particularly target women because this work is being done in central Nigeria, because in that setting it's easier to bring women together from different social groups, from different identity groups, than it is to bring young men together. They target youth because they feel like their identity, their future vision, their belief in what's possible, their understanding of self and other is a little more fluid, a little more plastic, a little more malleable, and that a powerful set of experiences could make a difference in that sort of context. So here's a quote from one of the participants in this process. I no longer feel like a stranger. Right? So what's going on here is an attempt to build trust, an attempt to create networks for dialogue, and also to tap mutual interests in beautification, more effective waste disposal, more sanitary conditions, recycling of materials that may have value, et cetera. So it's a small example, but it's an interesting example. Search for Common Ground started with this. They have since moved to bolder and more ambitious initiatives. For example, in the southern part of Nigeria, in Ogoniland, where the oil production for the world economy, for our cars, has basically created a sacrificial landscape. And as a result, armed insurgencies against the Nigerian government. They have done similar exercises, bringing together ex-combatants and local government officials to engage in the same sort of cooperative cleanups and so on. It's very interesting work. Second example, very different example. This is the Jordan River Valley, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza. The Jordan River is filthy, and the Jordan River the mighty Jordan, if you read your sacred texts, has been reduced to a trickle because of abstracting water up here by all the parties, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, taking water off for agriculture primarily and allowing the agricultural runoff to pollute the river. So it's a very, very serious problem. So this organization, Eco-Peace Middle East, attempts to deal with that by getting people to think of themselves as citizens of the Jordan River Valley. Not simply as Israelis, not simply as Palestinians, not simply as Jordanians. Some of that work is very similar to the trust building, and they work with high school students and a lot of the things that I mentioned earlier. But in this case, those people who are in the river, most of them in this photo, they are the mayors of small communities that are directly affected by the poor water quality and poor water availability. And so what Eco-Peace tries to do is bring together, let's say, an Israeli mayor and a Palestinian mayor who are both downstream from a failed effort at sanitation or water quality or something along those lines. And the goal here is not to transform their identities. The goal here is to tap their interests, because mayors are practical politicians. You won't be mayor for long if you can't deliver clean water and sanitation to your constituency. And the hope is that by helping these mayors coordinate and work together and see their common interest, they will then push political pressure upward to the national level, which is where most of the political blockage is around these sorts of cooperative opportunities. So another interesting example. Notice that it's very different than the work of Search for Common Ground. This is appealing to the hard-headed interests and trying to stimulate collective action around them. Third example, again, very different from the other two, involves indigenous communities in the Amazon and their attempt to force their way into more meaningful dialogues with mining companies, logging companies, hydroelectric facilities, and governments, the extractive industries in the Amazon that are doing so much damage to indigenous lands, indigenous communities, indigenous culture. Indigenous people, in theory, control a substantial portion of land in Brazil. The amount of land that is recognized legally as indigenous and has been demarcated as indigenous, shown here in the purple areas, it's larger than the size of California and Texas combined. So it's quite a bit of land. But of course, in practice, they don't control that land. They don't have meaningful power over that land. And they frequently suffer encroachments from all of those extractive industries that I just named. Now, the response of indigenous communities to this challenge has been diverse and heterogeneous. Lots of protest, lots of mobilization of activism, lobbying of the government, lobbying of the UN to pressure the government, building coalitions with international allies in the human rights and environmental communities, building coalitions across Brazil, etc. But one of the interesting strategies that they've started using recently is what's known as a consultation protocol. The Brazilian Constitution protects special rights for indigenous people. It's a very progressive document. And it says that they must be consulted on any land use or extractive project or anything like that that affects their land, their livelihood, and their culture. In practice, they're rarely consulted. Or they might be consulted at the 11th hour. The bulldozers have arrived, and they know they're losing the battle. And they're asked for their signature of approval in return for, let's say, the building of a clinic or something like that. And they might take it. They might sign because, they need the clinic, and they don't have any leverage in that case. The problem is that legal right to consultation is not in any way being meaningfully respected. So what the indigenous communities have started doing is they've started documenting and defining, this is what it would mean to consult with us. This is the consultation protocol, it's in Portuguese, the consultation protocol of the Xingu people, who are one of the more organized and politically mobilized indigenous communities in Brazil. And what this document says, if you're going to claim that you consulted with us, if you're going to claim that you met your legal standard, if you're going to try to claim that to get the permit from the government to start digging or cutting trees or whatever it is that you're doing, this is what you have to do. This is who has to be consulted. Not one member of our community that you bribed, but this central body that deals with this for us. This is how you have to consult with us. This is when you have to consult with us. This is how much time we have to deliberate. This is the kind of information in detail, this document's over 100 pages long, in detail that you must provide. We demand the right to bring our allies in the human rights and environmental community to the table for all conversations. This is the consultation protocol of the Yanomami people, a community that has several territories that straddle the border between Brazil and Venezuela, and that therefore are quite suspect by both of those governments over sovereignty concerns and so on. What's interesting about this is that the first half of the document is written entirely in the language of the Yanomami, which seems entirely appropriate to me. Why should they be working in some combination of Portuguese and English? Simply because that is the language that people who want to do these projects on their lands happen to speak. The second half is in Portuguese, and it says here, this protocol was collectively fabricated or constructed by we, the Yanomami and Yequana people, in a work that involved all of our leadership and associates over a period of 2 years. And again, it's over 100 pages long, and it's quite detailed. So in this case, it's not the identity transformation that you're seeking in the Nigerian case, working with youth or ex-combatants. It's not the hard-headed appeal to the mayors that we saw in the Israeli case. What they're trying to do here is to create a meaningful dialogue between the government, the companies, and the indigenous communities, and to use their legal rights to try to leverage that. And they've had some success with this. I don't want to this is a real uphill battle, and I don't want to minimize it. But they have had some successes. There's been some instances now where the courts have ruled that companies have failed to meet the standard. The goal here is to institutionalize these protocols as the normal way of consulting. They want this to be the standard that the court, which may not even understand the details, the judge in the case uses to say consultation has or has not occurred. And they've had some successes. There are lots of examples, other examples that I could give of this. And notice that the specific strategy in each of those three examples is somewhat different. The obvious question is, do these things work? Under what circumstances do they work? When do they succeed? When do they fail? After a couple of decades of this kind of work and the increasing documentation of these cases and sort of the scholars doing their work, we started to learn some lessons from this. I could talk about this all afternoon. I won't, Dr. Conca can make 20 minutes seem like 2 hours. I won't do that. But I will say that certain patterns emerge from the data. When these efforts engage people's livelihoods directly, they tend to be more successful. When they get people engaged in trust building, but not simply trust building through dialogue, trust building through actually working together, generating knowledge together, cooperating on initiatives together, they tend to work better. When they promote political inclusion, which is no surprise to anybody who works in peacebuilding, they tend to work better. And when they don't forget about the environmental outcome, It's fine to say environmental issues will allow us to create the political dynamic that we want, but if you don't actually deliver the environmental goods, the initiatives don't really get a lot of traction in the long run. What's interesting is that sometimes the foreign aid-based projects they seem to struggle, and there's a long conversation there that we could have. And also that many of the attempts to strengthen the capacity of governments. One theory about why these problems exist is because governments are weak. They don't have the regulatory capacity. They don't have the analytic capacity. So you see a good governance agenda. That's not wrong, but one of the challenges with that is that government is rarely a neutral actor in these cases. Government has a stake, government has an interest, and strengthening the hand of government is therefore, in some cases, not an aspect of effective conflict resolution. If you're interested in this and you want to know more about it, there is now an Environmental Peacebuilding Association. It's a very interesting group that several of us stood up about 4 years ago, now has several hundred members. About half of them are researchers like me. About half of them are people from this community of practice. So it's a very interesting organization. They have a young professionals interest group that's full of students. So if anybody's interested in that, get in touch with me and I can put you in touch. They recently published a white paper on the future of environmental peacebuilding. It makes for very good reading if you're interested in this. I'll conclude just by offering a couple of cautionary notes and a couple of just maybe sobering reminders about this hopeful agenda. This is a composite picture of the Earth as seen from space at night. It's a composite because, of course, if you think about it, it's not nighttime at the same time all around the world. So it is a composite. I have some students who are always like, oh my God, that's right, isn't it? So there we have it, right? It's a real reminder about where power and wealth reside on the planet and where they don't, right? Almost all of the case studies that we have and all the research that we have about environmental peace-building initiatives comes from the darkened zones on the planet. And even with that, there's a lot of asymmetry. There are more studies about the social impacts of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa coming from 2 countries than from the rest of the continent. Take a moment and guess in your head what those 2 countries might be. South Africa and Kenya. 2 former British colonies where English is widely spoken, 2 countries with modern international airports, 2 countries that are nominal democracies and that are full of activist NGOs, non-governmental organizations and social movement groups, right? Very comfortable place for researchers to work. So we know more about these dynamics in South Africa and Kenya than we do in any landlocked country in Africa, any former French colony in Africa, and so on. So we need to be better as researchers in moving. I've never seen an environmental peace-building study on indigenous communities in Australia, despite the pitched battles that they have been fighting for their land and their resources and their dignity for centuries, right? I haven't seen one in the United States, Europe. We need to change that, and that's the first thing that we need to keep in mind. Second thing we need to keep in mind, am I okay here, John? I'm wrapping.
You're fine.
Okay, on time,
You're
great.
We're going to 1:55, so you're in good shape.
Okay, great, so 2 more minutes. This is a Rwandan mountain gorilla. There are about 900 of them left on the planet. This gorilla was murdered by people who don't want an environmental peacebuilding initiative to succeed. The place is the sort of triple point between the countries of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Rwanda, which is the home to these gorillas. Each of these countries had a protected area, a park, if you will, to help try to preserve the habitat of the gorillas. Each of these countries really struggling to preserve those habitats from encroachment. And if you know anything about the history of the region, you know it has been besieged by violent conflict in recent decades, including conflict right in those parks. Rebel groups using the park as a staging area or something like that, right? So the countries, despite having very, very limited dialogue and very poor relations, started to come together to coordinate tourism revenue, parks management, and to create a border-crossing international protected area intent on preserving the habitat of the gorillas. There are problems with this initiative. It's not a panacea, but it's an interesting initiative, right? And it certainly fits into the category of what I've been talking about, efforts in environmental peacebuilding. Not everybody wants it to succeed. There are activities going on in these protected areas. It might be poaching. It might be some sort of criminal activity. It might be people just eking out a livelihood because that's the land that they could get access to, even though it's technically illegal to be doing so, who killed the gorilla as a warning to the park rangers to stay away from that part of the park and to not encroach on these sorts of activities. Unfortunately, it's not only gorillas that get killed. In the past decade or so, more than 1,000 environmental activists and land rights activists around the planet have been murdered or have disappeared under circumstances that seem to be very directly related. There's an international prize for environmental activists called the Goldman Prize, and one of the reasons the Goldman Prize exists is simply to shine a spotlight on people like this and try to keep them alive. 2 of the Goldman Prize winners over the years have been killed as well. I can point, the Global Witness is the organization, and this is their report, Defenders of the Earth. It makes for very important reading, but very sobering reading. And in the response to, we can basically go in 2 directions with this, right? We can double and redouble our efforts for peace and justice, or we can militarize the space in response. And this is one of the things that we are seeing in many places in conservation around the world. The training, this is a former Israeli commando who's training guards in the park, right? And this is the World Wildlife Fund underwriting sort of a barbed wire and armed guard approach to conservation. Use of drones is increasingly common, and now, I don't know if that is a necessary response to this. There may be places in the world where it tragically is. I have my doubts, but even if we concede that, how do you think this sort of militarization of the space plays with the local communities that are really going to be the ultimate determinant of whether this environmental peace-building initiative between the governments succeeds or fails? Because if that park can't survive in harmony with local communities, it doesn't have much of a future. So I'll end with a couple of thoughts simply by saying, first, if you're a student, talk to me. If you're interested in this, we can talk about universities, we can talk about graduate programs, we can talk about a summer in DC, internship opportunities, organizations that are worth knowing about. And don't hesitate to check out the Young Professionals group within the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, because it's designed to put people in conversation with each other around that. And the second thing that I will say is that, this is heavy stuff. This is hard work to sort of sustain positive emotions around and stay committed to. But it's important that people do that. And one of the things that I do to help me sustain that is read about the Goldman Prize winners. These are the 2023 winners from Turkey, Brazil, Zambia, Finland, Indonesia, and the United States. And the kind of work that they're doing to reinforce environmental justice, to use conflict resolution techniques, and try to promote environmental peace building. And so it's important that we have that positive narrative as well, and we see these really important positive examples. So I will stop there, and happy to take questions or hear people's observations.
Thank you for a very compelling presentation, Dr. Conca. What I am going to do is I am going to invite people to ask questions. Or make comments. All you have to do is raise your hand, and I will come to you with the microphone, and you can speak. So, questions, comments, responses, reactions, Dr. Conca's address, by all means.
Hello, Dr. Conca. My name is Lincoln. I'm looking forward to going into the field of environmental engineering, some form of development of technologies in relation to the environment and helping with the environment to stay green and for our future. Of course, that is not exactly what you talked about, but I want to know where's my place in the environmental peacemaking community, and how can I, as a STEM individual, use my abilities to help that initiative and help that organization style.
Hey, I'm sorry, tell me your name again.
Lincoln.
Lincoln. So that's a great question, Lincoln. Thank you for asking it. And one thing to keep in mind to start is that these processes work at many, many different levels, right? Some of the things that I talk about were sort of analytically a matter of individual cognition or small group dynamics. And some of them were international diplomacy and several different scales of social aggregation in between. And that's a kind of a hint that there's a room for a lot of different disciplinary entry points, ranging from psychology to diplomacy and sort of everything in between. In your case, I would point to a couple of examples. One of the ways that in some of these trust building exercises, some of the organizations that I described tried to proceed is they try to promote what we call cooperative knowledge building, right? Because often what you find in these cases is dueling bodies. We're all familiar with this from American politics, right? Dueling bodies of truth and of knowledge and of what in fact is true. And so trying to break that down by having people work together to generate an understanding. And so there's a whole set of practices around different kinds of workshops and different kinds of facilitated dialogues that encourage that. One of the real challenges in that space is that communities, sometimes the weaker communities in these conflicts and in these dialogues, don't have the technical capacity to accompany that. And so building out those sorts of skills, having allies who can carry those sorts of skills into those sorts of spaces, that's one thing that's absolutely critical. The second thing is we need a new technology. Those dams are not, 30 years from now, we will be storing more water than we do today. Because with climate change, just evening out the unevenness and weather extremes and so on, it's going to be essential. But God help us if we're storing water with those kinds of structures because of all the problems that come with them, the human rights violations, the environmental damage, the risks to communities, the failures, the flooding, and so on. So we need a new technology in this space. One of the most exciting projects that I've worked with was a period of about 8 years when we were taking graduate students to the Middle East every summer and working with a couple of the organizations I had on the screen, not EcoPeace, but a couple of the others that work on cooperation on water recycling and sustainable agriculture across the Israeli-Palestinian conflict divide. And what they were trying to do was help people use sort of a very low-tech, backyard, gray water recycling technology that would allow Palestinians to have enough water to stay on their land, to supplement their income by using that water, maybe to grow cucumbers in the backyard and sell them at the market on the weekend, and so on. And in the process of that, demonstrate that Israelis and Palestinians can work together around these issues. But technology's got to work. If it's sitting in the backyard and it smells, people won't engage. It has to meet the different regulatory standards of Israeli water quality and Palestinian water quality and so on. So there's an enormous need for a technical expertise that's oriented toward that kind of social engagement and so on. So I think there definitely is a space for where you're headed. Great question.
Thank you so much.
You bet, Lincoln.
Additional questions, comments, responses, reactions, please raise your hand. Oh, I'll be right there.
All right. Hello, Dr. Conca. My name is Bengali. Okay. So you mentioned the exploitation of some of these countries, such as Nigeria, for resources, but it seemed to me that you were emphasizing the onus on grassroots efforts and starting from there, and then kind of layering up from there. I don't know. It was just from my point of view. I just thought it was a little disingenuous to kind of reflect it to the people, because I understand the first world countries may have they'll have an effect on the people, but it needs to start with the people because it's affecting them. But I just thought that because the first world countries who were involved in the exploitation had a part in creating the conditions, it just seemed kind of hard for me to think the grassroots stuff could really trickle down and contribute to changing the wider landscape. But yeah.
Fair enough. It's a good point. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Bengali. I think I would say a couple of things in response to this. The first is there's no question there's a larger global political economy that is driving many of these challenges. I used the term sacrificial landscape to describe Ogoni land in Nigeria. And it hasn't been sacrificed for it's been sacrificed for the wealth of the Nigerian government far away from the coastal southern regions where the oil is actually being produced. And it's been sacrificed for people for Exxon, Shell actually in that case. And it's been sacrificed ultimately for a lifestyle that's a very sort of, high energy, oil dependent, changing the climate and so on and so forth. And so, in my mind, that's the starting point for the analysis. And so if we were going to roll out a comprehensive peace-building strategy around that particular phenomenon, it would have to work at several levels. There's absolutely no question, right? So there's a very interesting international initiative that's called Publish What You Pay that is part of that struggle, because many of the international oil companies that work with the Nigerian government to export that oil, because it's almost all exported, they sign secretive contracts denominated in dollars that disappear into the coffers of the Nigerian treasury and are very, very difficult to hold accountable. It's very, very difficult to press the Nigerian government to be more transparent around those things, which would be a great benefit to the Ogoni people. So you press the oil companies to do that, and there's an activist campaign that's trying to get them to make that sort of information public, right? So, it would be wonderful if American diplomacy was oriented toward solving that problem in that sort of direction, but the fact of the matter is that it's not. So I'm already making certain assumptions about who's an ally in this sort of work, and it's kind of just trying to be practical and say what can be done in the face of that, right? So but there certainly are international initiatives, there are national level reforms that are required, but at the end of the day, I think change comes from struggle, and I think rights-based approaches that create the ability for people to hold governments accountable and hold onto their rights, and also collaborate amongst themselves are the sorts of things that are going to create that sort of energy. So it's true that a lot of my work, it's interesting because when we wrote this book many years ago, we were taking much more of an international diplomacy sort of frame. And over the years, I've seen a lot more catalyzed positive change coming from the bottom up than from the top down. And so that's why I tend to privilege those examples. But I think your point's a critical one, much like Lincoln's point about, well, does my disciplinary background and skill set have a place here? There's nothing to say you have to work at the grassroots level, right? We need these initiatives at all level and coordination among them. So if people are more inclined to work on this through a global political economy lens, through a diplomacy lens, 100% needed as well. Great point.
Do you have a follow-up question or comment? Okay, good. Good. So according to my watch, it is 1:52. I don't think we're going to have time for another question because this panel is going to end at the time that was apportioned for your address will end at 1:55. So before I conclude this portion of our conference, I would like to share with all of you that our next panel will begin at 2:10. Please don't go anywhere. Please stay. The title of that panel is Religion in the Environment. The panelists will be Abbot John Klassen, who will present on the subject of Benedictinism in the environment. And then I will give a presentation on Islam in the environment. And that session will begin at 2:10, as I said, and conclude at 3:05 p.m. And then the final panel, which will begin at 3:20 and end at 4:15, and all of the panels and presentations, everything in this conference is taking place in this room. The one from 3:20 to 4:15 is entitled Environmental Justice. That's the title of that panel. And Dr. Ted Gordon will present some ideas there. And then Dr. Derek Larson will give a presentation entitled Global Environmental Justice. Okay, so there are a few more words I'd like to share. Dr. Conca, thank you for your presentation and thank you for your responses to the questions. I thank the questioners, and I also thank all of you for being here. And I look forward to seeing you in a few minutes when our next session will begin. And please, thank you.